Alright, welcome back. We are moving on now to Chapter 9, Language and Its Pitfalls. And this is one of my favorite topics in the whole class because language is so interesting to play with, and there's so many different variations that go on with it, so many different things that happen without us even realizing. It makes it a lot of fun. Your book is going to start off by looking at a couple of definitions of definitions, and so I thought that's where we'd start right now. First, we have what are called ostensive definitions, which is simply a method of defining by pointing. And so you think about maybe starting with a small child, teaching them words or teaching them what things are, and you might point to a little dog and say, that's a dog. Or point to a table and say that's a table. And so by pointing to an object and assigning a name to it, you're giving an ostensive definition, again, much like you would with a small child. We also have what are called stipulative definitions here. And a stipulative definition is a definition that only works in a particular context. So there's a specific way in which we choose to use a word in a particular way. And I just want to look at the example that's given in your book at the bottom of 130. For the purposes of this law concerning breaking or entering, when any part of the body enters the building, that shall count as entry. Okay, so that's the basic law that's being presented. And so he says, if I stick my little finger inside your door, normally you wouldn't say that I had entered your home. But under this stipulative definition, I have met the condition for entry. Right? So in this particular case, even though we might normally think entering your home means putting your whole body into it, under this stipulative definition, this very specific definition to a specific context, it could imply that you are in fact entering, even if one small section of your body were to enter into the door. So that is the stipulative definition as well. So those are the two primary ways today in which we might look at the idea of definition. Now, some of the stuff I'm going to give you here is not really from the book, but it's some really interesting stuff that I think helps us to understand what's going on in the world of language, what we might call part of the world of linguistics. And so I want to start off by talking about a guy called Roscelin of Campania, who lived from 1070 to 1120. I spent a lot of time in the medieval world, so to speak, and so this is one of the areas I get a little excited about. Anyway, Roscelin of Campania was a French cleric, and he is going to be responsible for creating a discipline called Nominalism. Basically, as it says there, he indicates that words are flatum vocus, basically vocal flatulence. Words are nothing more than air puffing out of your mouth. They have no substance, they have no validity, they have no reality. Now, what's the purpose of making a statement like that? What Roscelin was doing was actually countering a whole history of linguistics. Because going back to the ancient Greeks, where most of our knowledge really originates, you have this idea of universals, that the things that exist in this world are perhaps illusory copies of a reality that's somewhere else. Plato, for example, taught that the reason why a table was a table was because it was trying to participate in this thing that he called a form, this abstract, unchanging, absolute form of tableness that floated around in a Platonic heaven somewhere, and that it was that universal, absolute, unchanging thing that is real. The particular changing thing of this world is simply an attempt to picture that. It's a copy. And so real knowledge had to come from somewhere else. It wasn't part of this world. Aristotle also believed that knowledge of things were universal, that knowledge had to be something that was absolute and unchanging and unyielding. And so he would say, well, this is a table because that form of tableness dwells within it. Kind of like our modern concept of DNA, dwells inside of a thing, makes it appear to be a particular entity, gives it its color, its shape, its texture, and all of that. Well, the form for Aristotle, basically that's what it did. But it was that form that was real, not the thing. But when Roscelin came along, he said, this is not a table because it's trying to participate in some Platonic form somewhere else. It's not a table because there's something dwelling within it. It's a table because we speak English. That's the only reason. Long ago, we decided that things that were elevated off the ground and had a flat surface to them that we could sit things on, we're going to call those things tables. It's just a word. It's a completely arbitrary, made-up word that we've assigned to a thing. And through ostensive definition, we've been able to get others to accept that that's what we're going to call it. But what is real is that particular thing in the world, not anything else. And so that's what he means when he says that words are flatum vocus. They're vocal flatulence. They're a farting out of the mouth. Just puffs of air that has no great significance other than what we have given to it. It's the physical things of the world that are real. Well, Roscelin, of course, for presenting this view, got into a lot of trouble. He was on 3 separate occasions brought up on charges in front of the Inquisition for charges of heresy, basically a charge called tritheism, which is the belief that there are 3 gods as opposed to 1. Why? Well, because it was argued by St. Anselm, as well as others, Bishop Anselm at that time, that if you adopt this nominalistic view, then you cannot have a relationship between things. There's only the particular entity. And so the Father has to be separate from the Son, has to be separate from the Holy Ghost, hence there is no Trinity. That's heresy. Roscelin never said that, but that was what was inferred from his view. And so on 3 different occasions he found himself in front of the Inquisitions to answer these charges. But fortunately, he knew how to play the game, and he got around it. He would tell them, what they wanted to hear. He would allow them to burn his writings. He'd sit quiet for a while, and then he'd write it all up and start teaching it all over again. So his ideas do survive, and they make their way eventually to one of my favorite figures in philosophy, William of Ockham, who lived from 1290 to 1349. William of Ockham was born in or around the town of Ockham in England. We don't know a lot about his early life, but we know that he studied at Oxford University and that he taught there for at least a year. But in 1324, John Lutherell is going to bring him up on charges of tritheism, the same charge that Roscelin was brought up on for holding this view. Well, he challenged it, and he continued to fight it for 4 years, until he finally found himself face to face with the Pope, and he told the Pope, "You're wrong, I'm right." That, of course, didn't go over very well, and Occam got himself excommunicated because of that. Fortunately for him, the Emperor of Bavaria was also not too happy with the Pope at this point, and he liked Occam. He liked Occam's ideas. And so he allows Occam to come and become his court philosopher. He is going to present his own views. He's going to teach the way he wants to. He's going to write what he wants to with complete freedom. And that's a wonderful thing for someone in the Middle Ages. Anyway, with regards to this issue of language, Occam explains that we develop language in a particular pattern. And so he talks about 2 separate things. One is the idea of intention, the other is imposition. And so we start with this idea of first intention. First intention is to receive a mental image of a thing. So if I'm looking out into the world and I see a cat, for example, before there's any words or language or anything else, I just get a mental picture of that thing in the world inside my mind. But because I grew up in a culture that is based upon the English language, instantly, before I even realize it, I've shifted into second intention because my mind has picked out a word and attached it to that thing. You know, I mean, try this at some point. Look at anything that you're familiar with, a cat, a dog, a tree, a table, whatever, and before you realize it, your mind has already assigned that label to it. And so that mind picking out the word is second intention. We also have the idea of imposition. Now, imposition would actually come first in the very beginning. If we have no word for a particular thing, something new has just been found or created, then first imposition would come first. We would assign a word. We'd make up a word, we'd assign that word to it so that we'd be able to discuss it and communicate it with each other. But once we've grown up within a particular context, playing a particular language game, then the intention really is what we start with. But first imposition is imposing that name onto the thing. Second imposition is using a word to discuss the word. So much later on, when we start thinking in terms of analyzing language itself, then we might move to a second imposition. So if I have the idea of a cat, right, my first imposition would be to assign the word cat to that furry thing out there in the world. But second imposition would be my use of words to refer to the word cat, C-A-T. Okay. And let me see if I have the, yes. So we take this example here, cat has 3 letters. By having the quotation marks around the cat, then that tells me we're referring to the word. We're dealing with second imposition. Cat has 3 letters, C-A-T, 1, 2, 3, there they are. But if I didn't have that, then that would be ungrammatical because I would be referring to the thing in the world. Cat has 3 letters? Well, no, not unless he's been down to the post office and picked up the mail for you. Then he might have 3 letters. But otherwise, the cat doesn't have 3 letters. We need those quotation marks to show that we're talking about the word and not the thing. But in essence, that's how language develops. That's how language comes to us. And what Ockham establishes pretty much is going to hold true to us down through the ages. Now, I wanted to mention another individual here, W.V.O. Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine. Lived from 1908 to 2000. He was a local boy, came from Akron, went to Oberlin University. Anyway, in the 1950s, Quine looked at this idea of language, and he talked about what he calls the untranslatability thesis. And that's the idea that when we move from one language to another, we never fully are going to be able to grasp what that other culture means, because different languages will have an effect upon the way that we reason, upon the way that we think, upon the way that we process information. This is an idea that actually originated with Benjamin Whorf, when he developed what became known as the Whorfian hypothesis or the linguistic relativity hypothesis, that the language we speak affects the way that we think, reason, process information, and so on. And so Quine argued that when a person grows up playing a particular language game, they learn the ins and outs of that as they go along through life. But a person from the outside trying to learn that language is going to run into a lot of difficulty from that point forward. They're not really going to be able to do it. And so he uses an example to illustrate this. Suppose that we were discovered a South Sea island somewhere that it had no contact with the outside world for forever, and we wanted to come to find a way of communicating with that culture. Well, what linguists usually do is to go into that culture, they look at the people, they see the sounds that they make, the words that they make, in association with certain things. So let's suppose then that we come across this little fuzzy critter here, and this native says gavagai. Well, our automatic thought is, well, Gavagai, that must mean rabbit. But Quine says that's actually kind of an arrogant point, because we don't necessarily think in the same way that that culture does. Maybe they don't think in terms of whole or complete objects. Maybe what they think of is in terms of movement or action, and so maybe Gavagai means hopping or jumping. Maybe they only think in terms of parts or pieces of that culture, within that culture. And so maybe Gavagai means nose or ears or tail. It doesn't necessarily have to, they don't necessarily have to think the same way that we do. Right? For all we know, Gavagai could mean lunch, and he's planning to go catch it and cook it. We just don't know. And this is where so many of our problems come from in language, is the fact that we try to translate, but we translate with an arrogance that everybody thinks and acts in the same way that we do. And that's why we run into so many problems in this world, is because we think that we're getting the meaning of something, when in reality, maybe we're not, you know. Within German, we might use this phrase, er ist blau. Right? Er ist blau. If we translate that literally, it means he is blue. Now, we're going to think, well, that must mean that he's sad or depressed, because that's the way we use that phrase. But in Germany, to say someone is blue means to say that they're drunk. It's a very different meaning. Right? But if we don't realize the context, because we haven't been raised within that culture, we haven't been raised playing that language game, then we can very easily misunderstand what's being said. Okay? It's sort of like when, during the first Gulf War, President Bush used to mispronounce the name of Saddam Hussein. He would call him Saddam. And a lot of people didn't pay much attention to that, thinking it's just his accent, but he was actually doing that on purpose, because he understood that that simple change of phrasing makes a very big difference in what is being said. Saddam implies something that's princely, whereas Saddam implies something equivalent to a garbage collector. So, you know, there are these types of things that can happen, sometimes intentionally, but a lot of times accidentally, to where we just simply don't know, we don't understand. Okay. I'm going to have to end at this point, because for some reason this doesn't allow me to tape for more than 18 minutes at a time. So I'm going to stop at this point, but I will be back in the next lecture to finish off this talk with you on language and its pitfalls.